What's up, y'all? So I wanted to do a quick little intro before we got into the video. This video you're gonna see right now, I filmed it back in November, so it is a couple months old. I was supposed to add it back in December, but I didn't get around to doing it. This video was so long I had to edit it, and that takes a long time to do. So I wanted to post it up for you guys right now. And I have an Asian American Studies reflection video that I filmed back in December that I need to post as well to kind of conclude and wrap up this whole Asian American Studies videos I've been doing. Alright, so check it out. Without further delay, here is my video on the Filipino Americans. What's up, y'all? So this video is going to be focusing on the Filipinos. I'm going to give you some background information, some of the history on Filipino Americans. There are 11 major islands of the Philippines. Overall, there was about 7,000 islands, but these are very small islands though. They're the size of Arizona, the state Arizona. The first Filipinos, the first people who came to the Philippines, were referred to as Negritos. And the reason that they referred to them as this was because they were really short and really dark skin. This was about 25,000 years ago, you know. And then some of the other groups that came later, a little later, were the Indonesians, the Malays, and of course the Spanish. We all know the Spanish took over the Philippines. This happened about 400 years ago. Alright. How the Philippines got their name was from a Spanish prince at this time. His name was Prince Philip II. That's how the Philippines got their name, was from him. Alright. There are 3 major languages in the Philippines. The most well-known one is Tagalog. Majority of all Filipinos are Catholic because of the Spanish. The Philippines have a lot of Spanish influences. A lot of them live in the rural villages around the early 1500s. Around 1521, Spain took over the Philippines. So in 1898, Spain gave the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. During this time, they had this thing called pensionatos, which means students. This was sponsored by the U.S. government. They were able to bring Filipinos to America, to American colleges as students. And this went on from 1902 to 1910. They did various studies. They did engineering, they did education, agriculture, medicine. They did a bunch of different things, They stayed in American homes while they were attending school here in the States. They went to 40 different universities in the country. Once they graduated school, they were supposed to go back to the Philippines. They were just here just to go to school here and then return back to the Philippines. From 1910 to 1938, those individual people who did not graduate college, they were just unskilled workers. So let me talk a little bit about the workers from 1909 to 1934. The Filipinos were very different compared to other Asian immigrants during this time. The early Chinese, the early Japanese, the early Koreans. One thing that was different is that their religious beliefs, 90% of them were Catholics. They were very familiar with the European culture due to Spain. Another thing is that they spoke English. That's the biggest one, is that they spoke English. They knew English, unlike other Asian ethnic groups. When they first came here, they didn't speak it, or they didn't know it. So, but there were a few similarities with the other Asian immigrants that Filipino with the Filipinos. One being they were sort of like the Chinese. They were very, very poor when they first came to the States. They were not educated at all, or there's very little. A lot of them were very uneducated at this time, so they weren't like the Koreans and the Japanese, though they were very educated when they first came here. And a lot of them were young men. You know, there wasn't very many women who came to the U.S., the States. They also had a farming background, like some of the other Asian ethnic groups. So the differences between Hawaii and California were Hawaii had more women and contracts. You know, a lot of them worked at the sugar plantations. They did sugar cane. So California, the farm workers were in competition with the white workers. The white workers didn't like the Filipinos. One of the reasons they didn't like them was because they felt that the Filipinos were taking all the jobs away from the white people. So when they first started coming to this country, they didn't like them. But you know, the Americans didn't like the Chinese, they didn't like the Japanese, they didn't like anybody. When they first came to this country, they all wanted all the Asian groups out of California or out of the mainlands of the states, you know. So you kind of see the pattern that's going on. There are three major types of employment that the Filipinos did. One being domestic work. They did about 3/4 of them did this. 25% did domestics. They were house servants. They worked in restaurants, hotels, stuff like that. About 10% did Alaskan salmon fish canneries. What they did there was they cleaned the salmon and they packaged it. This was very temporary. It was only seasonal. They got paid about $40 to do this. And the biggest one that Filipinos did was agriculture. Over 60% did agriculture. They moved around a lot though. They moved around from field to field. So I want to talk about the race relationships. I want to talk about the race relations with the Filipinos. Alright, some of the attitudes towards the Filipinos coming, you know, most didn't like the Filipinos, you know. President McKinley made a statement about the Filipinos. He called them the little brown brother, and he said that it was their duty to educate them, you know, referring to Filipinos as a little brown brother. That is offensive, but if you take into consideration what the Secretary of Agriculture said, it doesn't seem that bad. He referred to them as monkeys and headhunters, which is worse than what President McKinley had said. I'd rather be called a little brown brother than be called a monkey and a headhunter. You know, so you see the difference. Even in today's society, it'd be considered prejudice to say stuff like that. But during this time, the times were different. The Filipinos, they learned about the Declaration of Independence and the rights of the free men. They also thought of America as land of opportunities, where they could come here, make a better life for themselves, better living, raise their children here, and do whatever they want to do. When it came to interracial marriages, a lot of them were okay with it. They didn't have a problem with it. I mean, if you take into consideration the history of the Philippines, you know, the Spanish, Filipinos are very unique, very different, because they're very experienced with other different types of cultures and people. So, you know, and that's one of the reasons probably why that their English is better than anyone else, and they were able to get jobs. That's why they were kind of in competition with the Americans or the white workers at this time. There was a lot of hatred and hostility towards Filipinos. It's because the economic competition between the Filipinos and the white workers. 150 whites stopped 60 Filipinos from working on an apple farm, and there was fights, there were stabbings, just a bunch of really bad things that happened during this time with the Filipinos, just because that they were Filipino, they didn't like them. So all this stuff started happening. In 1929, a Filipino man and a white woman were arrested. They were arrested because they were they were dating interracially. A picture surfaced with them, showed a picture of them, and eventually this caused a riot at a Filipino dance hall in January of the following year, 1930. About 200 white men were in a mob, and they started roaming the streets for anyone who were Filipino. They didn't like the Filipinos, so at this time, if you were Filipino, you probably wanted to stay home. You didn't want to be out in the streets because, if these men found you, they knew that you were Filipino. They would kill you. They would beat you, and unfortunately, one Filipino did get killed. He and several other Filipinos were beaten and property destroyed. So the judge, he made some comments about the Filipinos. And what he said was, "Damn the Filipino." So you get a sense already that he doesn't like the Filipinos. And you'd be right. He doesn't like the Filipinos. He says the Filipinos are mixing with young girls, young white girls, and he says they're keeping them out at all hours of the night. And he goes on to say is that some girls are carrying a Filipino baby inside them. So he has some hostility, some hatred towards the Filipinos. That last comment about having a Filipino baby, the woman is white and the guy is Filipino. So technically it'd be a biracial child, half white, half Filipino. And it kind of brings me back to the one drop rule. A long time ago, there was this one drop rule about, if you had any black in you, even if very significant, even if it was very insignificant, you'd still be considered black. Even if you were mixed, half white, half black, half Asian, whatever you're mixed with, if you had any black in you, then you'd be considered, black. However, and that's sort of how I felt when I read this about, this is sort of how I feel about what it said about, the guy being Filipino and then the girl being white, and they consider that being, having a Filipino baby, which isn't correct either. So that's sort of what it kind of reminded me of. And the judge also said, besides the little brown men comment about the Filipinos, he also said that he thought of them as peacocks. He said that they attract attention to the young American and Mexican girls. So if you've ever seen a peacock or know what a peacock is, you know that the female peacocks are very plain looking. And if you look at a male peacock, they're very colorful. They're very colorful looking. Right, so that's sort of what he's referring to. There was a case in 1933 by Salvador Rodin, right, 1933. California law prohibited interracial marriages with people who were black and mixed and Mongolians. They specifically referred to them as Negros, Muletos, or Mongolians. So, interracial marriage was frowned upon. They, at this time. So anyways, Salvador got a California appeals court to approve his marriage because he wasn't either one of those racial groups that they had mentioned. He was Malay. But unfortunately, what happened is the California legislature amended the law to include Malaysians. Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. So I wanted to talk about this act. They had an Immigration Act of 1924 that prohibited other Asians, but it didn't apply to the Filipinos. This act, what it did was, it gave independence to the Philippines in 10 years, and it set a quota for them as well. Only 50 can enter the country a year to the States. If they needed more in Hawaii, then it was a different situation. And the Asians were classified as being aliens, so they were ineligible to New Deal programs. So it's sort of like they clearly didn't think of the Asians as Asian Americans. They considered them Asian nationalists, the Filipinos. They did. Even though technically the Philippines was American territory at this time, they still were not recognized as American citizens. Along with the other Asian groups, the population for the Filipinos coming to the States had drastically changed. The American image that they had once had of America had drastically changed over the years. And in 1929, about 11,000 of the Filipinos immigrated to the States. 3 years later, in 1932, it drastically lowered to about 1,000. I wanted to talk about the 1934 Act, the Repatriation Act of 1935. This act, the government tried to get the Filipinos out of the States. And one way that they did this was they offered to pay the Filipinos to go back to the Philippines. Sort of like a vacation, a trip back to the Philippines. At this time, it cost about $100 to go back to the Philippines. So the government paid this. But there was a catch. The catch was, you can go back, you just can't return. This was the government's way of trying to reduce the Filipino population on the mainland of the States, like California. This not very many people went. Some did. The LA Times advertised this. They refer to it as a luxuriant ocean liners. Like I said, only 2,000 Filipinos went back to the Philippines. The problem going back was that it was looked upon bad. They were looked down on for this, because it's sort of like they fell. People, the stigma of they fell coming to America, and then a couple years later that they returned back. So it was frowned upon, and the fact that the economy in the Philippines was very poor was another reason why most Filipinos did not want to return back to the Philippines. A lot of the Filipinos came during the Great Depression. 80% of the single men were under 30 years old. A lot of them gambled, and they did cockfighting. If you don't know what cockfighting is, it's where they have chickens fight. You bid on the one that you want to win, and if they win, you earn the money. And a lot of Filipinos now, they put like blades on the chicken as well as some of the Mexicans. They do cockfighting as well, and that's one thing that they actually have in common with each other. when it came to marriages, the Filipinos, they married Mexican women, they married white women, and they married women of Filipino descent as well. So let me get into a little bit about what was going on after World War II. A lot of the Filipinos had to register to be in the service. About 40% of them, 16,000, registered, and one thing that had changed is once you became a soldier, you were considered as an American citizen, and they were able to buy land as well. There was an act placed before this called the Alien Land Act, which prevented the Japanese from purchasing land. If they already had land, they were able to keep it, but they weren't able to buy more or lease land, or people weren't able to lease land to the Japanese for more than like 3 years. But this did apply to other Asian ethnic groups as well. Because what makes you think it'd be any different for the Chinese, the Koreans, and the early Filipinos? Because at this time, most Americans couldn't tell the difference between Asians anyways, so they were treated all the same. And what also changed was the Executive Order of 8802. This stated that people could not discriminate against you because of your race or your color or whatever, and for employment. So if you were looking for a job, they couldn't discriminate against you. That's what the Executive Order 8802 was for. Even to this day, they can't discriminate you basis on your color, your color of your skin, your race, your gender, religious, whatever. They can't discriminate against you. If you wanted to buy a house, the real estate person can't say, I only sell to we don't sell to Asians, or we don't sell to blacks. They can't do that. It's illegal to do. Also, what had also changed was that the Filipinos were able to marry whites. 20 years before this, they weren't able to. And also the quota for the Filipinos coming into the country had doubled from to 50 to 100, which wasn't a huge increase, but it's better than 50. So the post-war War II immigrants, some of the women of Filipino descent were war brides and children of Filipino soldiers. War brides is an Asian girl or a Filipina coming from the Philippines, and they marry a soldier, American soldier. So what happened after 1965, the post-1965 immigrants? There was a huge surge of Filipinos coming into the States. So the Filipino population went from 200,000 in 1960 to 1.5 million in 1990. Huge difference. There was over 600,000 that came from 1960 to the 1980s. So that's a huge difference. And they're also the second largest Asian group that was coming to the States. 40% of the Filipinos were doctors. They practiced in the U.S. About 20% of them were nurses. There was a large group of Filipina women who were nurses. So let me give you a statistic right now, a very interesting statistic that I found very interesting. Filipinos are the second only to Mexico in immigration. I found that really interesting. Really interesting fact. I didn't know that. I don't know if you know this, but Tagalog is the third most spoken foreign language here in the States. So the average family size for a Filipino family is 4. They just had 2 kids. It wasn't like the Chinese and some of the other ethnic groups at this time who were having a ton of kids, like 10 or 12 kids. they did this for, other reasons, to help support the family, farming and stuff like that. So that's sort of why the older generation of Chinese and other Asian ethnic groups, they have a huge family, which for this reason. The Filipinos have a higher education achievements than the Americans do. Okay, so let me talk about the workforce for the Filipinos really quickly. Filipinos, they have the highest rate, 75%. Unfortunately, they have a very low business ownership. Not many of them are business owners. Only 2% are in farming, so it's very low. And the income for Filipinos here in the States is much higher than the Filipinos that are born in the Philippines. So that was a little bit about the history of the Filipinos. Hopefully you take something out of this video, something good out of the video, or it opens your eyes to new ideas and thoughts. And if you didn't like it, oh well, can't please everyone, but rate, comment, subscribe if you like my channel, and I'll talk to y'all later, right?